Sure. I was born and raised in Western Pennsylvania in a very rural, tiny town in Amish country, north of Pittsburgh by about 1 hour. Really, my biggest influences in my life were my dad and my grandfather, my father's father. My entire family emigrated to the United States from Greece, from the island of Rhodes. All four of the grandparents in 1931 on my dad's side, 1934 on my mother's side. The week after I turned 18, I went to Washington, D.C., went to school at George Washington University. I earned a bachelor's degree in Middle Eastern Studies, and I stayed for a master's degree in legislative affairs with a focus on American foreign policy analysis. My graduate school advisor, it turned out, was undercover as a graduate school advisor. He was a CIA officer looking for people who might fit into the CIA's culture. He believed that I would fit into the CIA's culture, and he recruited me into the CIA. I spent 15 years there. The first half of my career was in analysis, specifically on Iraq. And then the second half of my career was in counterterrorism operations. I served many tours overseas in counterterrorism. I was the chief of CIA counterterrorism operations in Pakistan just after the 9/11 attacks. And that's where things sort of begin to turn. I'm sorry to say that I was the only person who objected to the CIA torture program. I did so internally, which just fell on deaf ears. And then after I left the CIA, I decided finally to go public in a nationally televised interview. And I said that the CIA was torturing its prisoners, that torture was official U.S. government policy, and that the policy had been personally approved by the president. All hell broke loose, as you might imagine. But in the meantime, I took a job as the chief investigator on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, working for John Kerry. After I left the Foreign Relations Committee, the government fell on my head, and I was arrested and charged with 5 felonies, including 3 counts of espionage, for that interview with ABC News, in which I said that the CIA was torturing its prisoners. To make a long story short, they would resign as my attorneys if I didn't take the plea, because I was realistically, they said, facing 12 to 18 years. Take the 23 months and make it go away. And so I did. And the funny thing, Mark, is that I was at the CIA a long time, and I would have assumed that they knew me. And if they thought that prison would silence me, they didn't know me at all. So I did my 23 months, and I've been a vocal critic of the CIA and of torture and of human rights abuses ever since. My father took me to an auction, and he bought a box of junk. I still remember he paid 50 cents for it. It was just a box of just junk that was left over. But that junk happened to include a shortwave radio. And it opened up an entire new world for me.
That was cute. And they bought me a set of walkie-talkies that year for Christmas. And then when I was 16, I told them I wanted to be a spy in the Middle East. And my father said, "Come on, you're still with the spy? With the spy thing? Can't you be a dentist or something?" And I said, "Dad, I'm serious. I want to be a spy in the Middle East." And so I became a spy in the Middle East. And I loved every minute of it. I learned to speak fluent Arabic. I immersed myself in the culture, the history, the poetry, and the literature, and succeeded there.
It was decidedly trending. The Shah of Iran had been overthrown. The Ayatollahs had come into power, and they took the American embassy and then held 55 American diplomats hostage for 444 days. And I was obsessed with this hostage crisis and wanted to learn as much about the Middle East as I could. I can't tell you why I was more interested in the Arab side of things than the Iranian, but Arab culture just has always fascinated me. And even when I was in college, I went backpacking one summer with my girlfriend. We spent 3 months, and she wanted to go to London and Paris and Rome, and we did all that. But then we also went to, Istanbul and Jerusalem and Cairo at my insistence. And it's a good question. It was kind of a combination of the two. On the one hand, I was so fascinated by the whole place. Like, for example, even as a teenager, I wanted to know how these little royal families in these little tiny countries got to be royal families, and why was, for example, the Kuwaiti family a ruling family and not a royal family, and all the others were royal families, and why were some emirs and sheikhs and the others were princes and kings, and I loved it. What made the job easier was that the United States has always had very close relations with these countries, and so we were always seen as the good guy, and relations were close, and we weren't targeting these countries for recruitment because our intelligence liaison relationships were close enough that they were giving everything to us anyway. So when I was working there, it was Iranians that I wanted to go after, or Iraqis that I was going after, or Syrians, or Russians and Chinese for that matter. We didn't have this. We didn't have the kind of relationship with these different countries that would have caused any kind of friction or difficulty, and it made life very, very easy for me there. Well, I'll answer you in two ways. I worked for a deputy director at the CIA. I was his assistant, my last headquarters position, and he had a mantra that he used to repeat every single day, that the job of the CIA is to recruit spies, to steal secrets, and then to analyze those secrets so that the president can make the best informed policy. That was the bottom line. The tech and the fancy stuff, that's all layered on top of it. But the bottom line is we recruit spies to steal secrets. And then when you're in the field, actually in the act of recruiting a spy to steal a secret, there's a process there that we called the asset acquisition cycle. It was spot, assess, develop, recruit. So you and I are at a diplomatic cocktail party. I go up and introduce myself, just like I'm going to introduce myself to the other 50 people in the party. But you happen to be from, North Korea, or China, or Russia, or Cuba. So I'd like to get to know, and I'm going to invite you to lunch. So I'm assessing your ability to have information that I would find useful. And then I begin developing you. That's the fun part, actually. And that's the longest part of this, where we're going to start with lunch. And then in a year's time, or 6 months, or 24 months, or however long it takes me, I'm going to make you my best friend. I'm going to spend a ridiculous amount of money on you. We're going to vacation together. Our wives are going to be friends. Our children are going to play together. And eventually, when the time feels right in my gut, I'm going to ask you to commit espionage for me. Treason, maybe, in some cases. And you're going to do it. Maybe because you think I'm great and you love me and you love this friendship we've developed. Maybe it's for the money. Maybe it's because you've been passed over for promotion and you want to get revenge against your boss. Maybe it's because you just love the United States, because you love these Hollywood movies and you want a piece of it. Or maybe you're an adrenaline junkie and you just love the excitement of the clandestinity. But for one reason or another, you're going to say yes to that pitch. 9 times out of 10, you just go in cold. And you have a pocket full of business cards, and you just hand them out to everybody. Once in a while, I can count twice in my career, where headquarters sent me a cable and saying, there's this party at such and such an embassy. We heard the North Koreans are going to be there, or the Russians are going to be there. And so I say, okay. And then I make sure that I go, and in one case, I actually did surveillance on the North Korean for several days before the party, and I noticed that he was literally going fishing every day after work so that he could eat.
Wow.
And I thought, okay, well, if he doesn't run screaming from the room, I'm going to take him to a nice restaurant. I'm sorry to say that he ran screaming from the room, but not literally, figuratively. So that went nowhere. But usually you just go work the room. Hey, how are you? Hey, I'm John Kiriakou from the American Embassy. So nice to see you. Oh, what do you do for a living? Oh, you work at the port? That sounds fascinating. What do you do at the port? Whatever it is, it's fascinating, and I want to hear more about it.
Sure. There is an enormous staff of psychiatrists, psychologists, sociologists, and anthropologists at the CIA. Enormous staff. And so you're well trained in what to look for and then what to do once you've spotted what we call a vulnerability. Now, a vulnerability doesn't necessarily have to be negative. Maybe your vulnerability is you really, really love your kids. And in your country, whatever country you happen to be from, your kids don't really have the kind of educational and economic opportunities that they might have in the United States. So if you want your kid to go to Harvard, done. Well, we can put your son or daughter in any university in America, and if you give me 2 hours in your code room, I'll pay for it. Wow. I said naked. Yeah. 9 times out of 10, this is strictly a financial agreement. You give me money. You give me information, I give you money. It's as simple as that.
Sure, that was very specifically a counterterrorism position. There were several groups. It's funny. When I first saw the position was open, it said this was for a counterterrorism operations officer working against 2 Greek groups, one called Revolutionary Organization 17 November, the other called Popular Revolutionary Struggle, but also working against Arab groups, most specifically the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP General Command, and the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine, as well as the Abu Nidal organization and the Libyans. They said that the successful candidate will have either Greek or Arabic language fluency. As it turned out, I was the only person in the CIA that was fluent in both Greek and Arabic. And so I got the job. It was just about then that communist Arab terrorism went away. The PFLP and the DFLP and Abu Nidal, they don't exist anymore. These were old men. They retired, they moved to Damascus, and they lived happily ever after. The Greeks were out killing people all the time. They killed the British defense attaché when I was there. They had previously killed the American CIA station chief, 2 American defense attachés, the Turkish ambassador, the Turkish deputy ambassador, the Greek minister of finance, the minister of communications, the head of the central bank. This was a terrible, terrible group.
Wow.
And so my job was to work with the Greek National Intelligence Service and the Greek National Police to try to infiltrate these 2 groups and to destroy them from the inside.
And what happened?
We stirred up a hornet's nest, and they murdered my next-door neighbor, the British defense attaché, Stephen Saunders. I liked Stephen very much. Stephen had a huge personality. We used to joke that he was a media whore because as soon as he saw a camera, he would run right in front of it and say, would anybody like an interview? I am the British defense attaché. And we would all laugh. One night we were at a party at the French defense attaché's house, and I had just gotten a new car that day that the CIA had bought me. It was a level 4 armored BMW 540. It was the first 540 in Greece, to the point where we couldn't even insure it. We had to insure it through a company in Germany because I needed a big engine to carry all that armor. And Stephen was making fun of me. We were standing, it was Stephen, the French, the American attaché, and me. And Stephen was making fun of me in a friendly way. And he said, "You Americans, you're so paranoid about security." He says, "This is an EU country. It's a NATO country. What are you so afraid of?" And everybody chuckled. And I said, "You Brits live in a dream world. If you think that because they have pretty beaches and palm trees that they're not going to kill you if they have the chance. Believe me, if they have the chance, they're going to kill you." And then they killed him.
As an assassination.
They assassinated him in broad daylight on the main road from our neighborhood to the British and American embassies in April of 2000. I was about a quarter of a mile behind him when they killed him. A taxi driver pulled him out of the car and rushed him to a hospital. He died 20 minutes after they got there. 17 November usually would drop a manifesto at the site of the hit. Sometimes they would put it in a garbage can and call a leftist newspaper and tell them where to find it. Rarely they would mail it to the newspaper. They didn't leave a manifesto when they killed Stephen. And so 4 months passed, and I went into work one day like I did, every day, and my boss runs into my office and he said, "Did you see the manifesto?" I said, "What manifesto?" He said, "The Saunders manifesto." I said, "They didn't drop a manifesto." He said, "No, they dropped it today. Have you seen it?" And I said, no. He said, they talk about you. And I said, me? That's not possible. I said, I've been so careful with my security. I'm more careful than anybody I know. He shows me the manifesto. It says in Greek, "Είδαμε τον μεγαλοκατάσκοπος." We saw the big spy. It says, but we knew he was armed and he was driving an armored car. And so we elected to carry out the revolutionary sentence on the war criminal Saunders.
Whoa.
And my boss said, you have to go. Yeah, I said, go where? He said, you have to go home, like right now. I said, I just took my kids to school. I can't just go home now. He said, we'll pick up your kids. We'll pick up your wife. You have to go now. I went to the airport in an armored car. They had an armored car pick up my two sons. And my sons were little. They were like 6 and 3. And they picked up my wife. We got to the airport and I said to her, I am so sorry. And she said, I want a divorce. I'm not doing this anymore.
Wow.
So we flew to New York. She flew to Cleveland. I flew to Washington and started working against 17 November from headquarters. They lasted another like 18 months. One of the bomb makers was carrying a bomb to put under the car of a Greek shipping magnate. And the bomb went off and it blew his hands off and it blew his right eye out. And as he was bleeding to death, he confessed to a policeman that he was 17 November. He gave the names of all of his comrades and the location of their weapons cache, and then the cop saved his life. And so the entire group was destroyed in April of 2002, and most of them are still in prison. A couple of them have done their time and have gotten out. But the founder, the lead assassin, and the 3 lead bomb makers are doing sentences of 1,765 years. Pakistan, as the chief of CIA counterterrorism operations.
Wow.
It was the biggest job I ever had in my life.
That's a big deal.
Yeah.
That's a big job.
Yeah.
Whereabouts in Pakistan?
Primarily in Islamabad, but wherever we needed to do the raid, we went and did the raid. I saw the 4 corners of Pakistan and everything in between. And there were a lot of moving parts at the time. You know, it wasn't just us operating in a bubble and trying to, destroy Al-Qaeda. At the same time, the White House is working with the CIA to come up with what became a torture program, a rendition program, an archipelago of secret prisons all around the world. And none of us had any idea that this was happening. The first inkling that I got that something was up was when the Pakistanis came to me one day. We had several very successful weeks of counterterrorism raids where we're just breaking down the door of Al-Qaeda safe houses with battering rams and just grabbing everybody. And the Paks came to me one day and said, listen, the jail is full. You've got to do something with all these guys. We can't just hold these guys indefinitely. So I called CIA headquarters, the Counterterrorism Center, and I said, the Paks came to me and said that the jail is full. We were keeping everybody in the Rawalpindi jail outside of Islamabad. They said the jail's literally full and they want these guys out. What do you want me to do with them? And they said, we want you to put them on a C-12 cargo plane, a transport plane, and send them to Guantanamo. And I said, Guantanamo, Cuba? And they said, yes. I said, why in the world would we send them to Cuba? And they said, and I thought this was a great idea, we're going to keep them in Cuba for 2 or 3 weeks until we can figure out which federal district court to charge them with. The idea was that we would charge all of them with terrorism or conspiracy or providing material support for terrorism. And we would charge them in Washington, New York, or Pennsylvania because that's where the 4th plane went down. I said, that's a great idea. Loaded everybody onto a series of C-12s, flew them to Guantanamo. We put 770 people there at one point. But then someone in Vice President Dick Cheney's office observed, they don't really have any rights in Guantanamo. It's ours, we control it, but it's not American territory, so they don't have any U.S. legal rights. Why don't we just keep them there forever? And then that became the policy. And that's where the big split came for me. I did not yet know that there was a formal torture program. I learned that in May of 2002. Torture actually began on August the 2nd, 2002. But I remember saying to my boss, this is illegal. This is clearly a violation of the Geneva Convention. And it's a violation of U.S. law as well. We shouldn't be doing this. And he said, listen to me, because I'm only going to say it once. He said, this has already been worked out at a pay grade far above yours or mine. We're not here to make these decisions. We're here to do as we're told. And that didn't sit right with me. So I went back to headquarters at the end of my tour in Pakistan, May of 2002. I was in the sandwich line in the CIA cafeteria, and one of the senior officers from the Counterterrorism Center came up to me very casually and said, "Oh, hey, I'm so glad I ran into you. I meant to ask you, do you want to be certified in the use of enhanced interrogation techniques?" I had never heard that term before. And I said, enhanced interrogation? I said, what does that mean? And he said, we're going to start getting rough with these guys. I said, well, what does that mean? And then he described these 10 techniques, everything from a smack across the face to waterboarding and sleep deprivation and freezing.
Freezing.
They called it the cold cell. I can describe it in a moment. I said, that sounds like a torture program. He said, it's not torture. The president approved it, and the Justice Department said we can do it. I said, give me an hour. I need to think about this. I walked out of the cafeteria. I went up to the 7th floor of the CIA. That's the executive floor. And I asked a very, very senior official for whom I had worked in the Middle East 10 years earlier for some advice. I knocked on his door, no appointment. And I said, listen, I was just approached and asked if I wanted to be trained in these enhanced interrogation techniques. What do you think of that? And he said, first of all, let's call a spade a spade. They can use whatever euphemism they want. This is a torture program. And torture is a slippery slope. And you know how these guys are. Some of them are cowboys. And somebody's going to kill a prisoner. And then there's going to be a congressional investigation, and then a Justice Department investigation, and somebody's going to go to prison. Do you want to go to prison? And I said, no, I don't want to go to prison. As it turned out, I was the only person who went to prison. But I went back downstairs and I said, this is a torture program. I have a moral and ethical problem with it. I think it's illegal, and I don't want to have anything to do with it. And so they cut me out, which was fine. I preferred to not know anything. I preferred to not be read into the program. But then, on the strength of my work in Pakistan, I was promoted, and I was named the executive assistant to the CIA's deputy director. And in that position, I had access to literally everything that the CIA was doing around the world. And it was on August 2nd that we began torturing Abu Zubaydah, who was the first high-value prisoner that we had. I led his capture in Faisalabad, Pakistan in March 28th. Yeah, I was standing on a coffee table in the safe house with 60 people arrayed in front of me, and I said, listen, the orders are to take them alive. Do not shoot them. And of course, as soon as the proverbial shit hits the fan, a Pakistani policeman just opens fire and shoots him 3 times with an AK-47 in the thigh, the groin, and the stomach. And the rest is history. Well, in the immediate term, I was passed over for promotion, which was kind of funny to me because I had just captured with these 2 hands the number 3 in Al-Qaeda. And in my promotion panel, the chief of counterterrorism said, exact words, I had displayed a shocking lack of commitment to counterterrorism.
Whoa.
Well, the deputy director then promoted me just with the stroke of his pen. So no big deal. But then a friend of mine at the agency who happened to be a lot of things. We go to the same church. We're in the same men's group. He happens to be a psychiatrist, and he happens to also be a brigadier general in the U.S. Army. He's a CIA psychiatrist. He came up to me and he said, hey, buddy, I got to tell you, they call you the human rights guy behind your back. And I said, yeah, I know. I've heard that. And he said, that's not a compliment. And I said, Steve, I'm on the right side of this. They're not. I said, I'm not going to change my point of view just because they say something behind my back. And I kept that up for another couple of years. I did another tour, and then decided, listen, I have 5 children. I need to put them through college. I have to start making some real money. So I resigned from the CIA, went into the private sector, and in the private sector, and it changed the course of the rest of my life. I got a call from Brian Ross, a very prominent journalist with ABC News in the United States, a 7-time Emmy Award winner. And he said that he had a source who said that I had tortured Abu Zubaydah. I said that was absolutely untrue. I was the only person who was kind to Abu Zubaydah. And he said, well, you're welcome to come on the show and defend yourself. I had no idea that was a reporter's trick because I had never spoken to a reporter before. And so I said I'd think about it. Well, that was on a Monday. On Wednesday, President Bush gave a press conference, and one of the reporters there asked him about these rumors that the CIA was torturing prisoners. And he looked right in the camera and he said, "We do not torture." And I said to my wife, who was a senior CIA officer, I said, he's a bald-faced liar. He's looking the American people right in the eye and he's just lying to us. 2 days later was Friday. The president leaves the White House from the South Portico, the back door of the White House, and he's walking to the presidential helicopter to go to Camp David for the weekend. And a reporter shouts a question about torture and the CIA, and he stops and he turns and he says, well, if there is torture, it's because of a rogue CIA officer. And I said to my wife, Brian Ross's source is at the White House, and they're going to pin this on me. So I called Brian Ross and I said, I'll give you your interview. And I decided that no matter what he asked, I was simply going to tell the truth. And I'm proud to say I brought down torture in the United States. John McCain, God bless his soul, I probably disagreed with John McCain on 99% of the issues. But he became my champion in the U.S. Senate. And he wrote what became the McCain-Feinstein Amendment banning torture. And then while I was at prison, I was incarcerated, he not only spoke on the floor of the Senate urging the president to pardon me and release me, but he gave a speech on the floor of the Senate saying that the country owed me a debt of gratitude because without my revelations, the American people would not have had any idea what the CIA was doing in their name, carrying out this abomination. And so I did my 23 months. I came out, and I'll tell you one funny thing. I was on this British show. The first interview I gave when I got out, the BBC. What's it called? Crossfire? I forget the name of it. It's very popular. Yeah. One guy who asks the questions, and he comes out swinging. Yeah. So he asked me a couple of very provocative, very mean-spirited questions, and I answered them just like I'm speaking to you now. And finally, he grew a little frustrated, and he said, you are not showing any contrition at all. You have not apologized for your crime. You haven't said anything about having revealed this classified information. And I said, contrition? I'm not contrite. I'm not apologizing. I would do it again today if I had the opportunity. I said, I'm not afraid of these people. I took their best shot, and I came out stronger on the other end. And I said again, same thing that I said earlier. I said, I am on the right side of history, and they are not. When their obituaries are written, the obituaries are going to say that they were war criminals. You know what? I did not struggle with that. I'm glad that you brought it up because I think this is a very important point. I did not have that internal struggle because it has been proven time and time again, after years and years of research, that torture simply doesn't work. Now, there was a real reason why we were torturing, and that was revenge. I understand that. I disagree with it, but I understand. But don't torture and then pretend that you're doing it because there's a ticking time bomb somewhere and you're trying to prevent the next attack. You're not trying to prevent the next attack. 9/11 was the greatest intelligence failure in American history, far worse than the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. And it was because the CIA was asleep at the switch. The deaths of 3,000 Americans in one day was on us because we didn't do our jobs. So I get that these guys wanted revenge. That doesn't make it right. But then to pretend that you have to do these torture techniques because, well, the next attack could be worse and we need to disrupt the next attack. Come on. We're not stupid. And so I never bought it. Never bought it. I do. They're not going to be popular with the current occupant of the White House, but this was a war of choice. And it was a war that we chose to participate in after being browbeaten by Benjamin Netanyahu and his extremist right-wing government. You know, it was my experience at the CIA where literally every Israeli prime minister since the 1980s would come to Washington, which they do all the time. And no matter who happened to be in the White House, they would say, please bomb Iran, please bomb Iran, please bomb Iran. And every president would say, we're not going to do that until this president. Now, the CIA published not one, two national intelligence estimates, which are the highest level sense of the intelligence community publication that exists, saying that Iran did not have a nuclear weapons program. Not only that, but Ayatollah Khamenei had issued a fatwa back in the 80s forbidding the creation of a nuclear weapons program. They were certainly enriching uranium, but not up to anything near weapons grade levels. I understand, I get it, that Iran is this existential threat to the Israelis, but Israeli national interests don't necessarily coincide with American national interests. And I want my government to represent American national interests. If the Israelis have a problem with Iran, that's for the Israelis to deal with. But the intelligence was very clear that Iran did not have a nuclear weapons program. Okay, just for the benefit of the doubt, let's pretend that they did have a nuclear weapons program. President Trump said in October that the U.S. Air Force had obliterated it with a 30,000-pound bunker buster bomb, a Moab, the mother of all bombs. We had obliterated it. And then, like magic, 4 weeks ago, they're 6 weeks away from building a bomb again. Well, they were 6 weeks away from building a bomb in 1986, and still there was no bomb. So I think it's high time that we start acting in the best interests of the United States rather than in the best interests of Israel. And frankly, I don't think attacking Iran was in the best interests of Israel either. Oh yeah, I believe that very strongly. Not because Trump is weak. I don't think Trump is weak. I think he's actually very strong. But because of the construct of the American political system, you know, politics run on money. And the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, AIPAC, is incredibly well funded. And they will run candidates against you if you are not 100% pro-Israel. And 5 times out of 6, at least in the last election, they would win those races. And so would you rather take $150 million for your campaign from wealthy donors and toe the Israeli line? Or do you want to risk having them run a candidate against you and then not winning re-election? Most American politicians fall into line. Came to a head during the presidency of someone who could be pressured by Benjamin Netanyahu, where previous presidents couldn't. And now we're in this war. I'll give you 2 answers. The first one, the easy one, is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal asked President Trump 2 weeks ago, who is your closest advisor on these politico-military issues? And his answer was, I don't have an advisor. I just trust my gut. That is very, very dangerous. You need a team of rivals. You need the best and the brightest. You need to surround yourself with the smartest thinkers on these issues. And he hasn't done that. That's answer number 1. Answer number 2 is, over the course of decades, the CIA has been demonstrably weak in developing human intelligence inside Iran. It's what we call a denied area, where we can't just, walk out of the American embassy in Tehran and, target some Iranian government official for recruitment, because there is no American embassy in Iran, and there hasn't been since 1979. And so we rely on liaison services, which really means Mossad. Now, if there's one thing Mossad's really, really great at, it's targeting intelligence, because they'll recruit every Afghan refugee in the country and give him $10 a month to just tell them where the generals live, where the nuclear scientists live, so they know where to target the cruise missiles. On the other hand, the intelligence that they get on the day-to-day operation of the Iranian government, on the policies of the Iranian government, largely come from Iranian Jews who live in the West, or from the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, the MEK, which until the Obama administration was a terrorist group listed on the State Department's list of international terrorist groups, which had murdered an American ambassador in Tehran in the 70s and attempted to murder an American general in the 70s. But now we're friends with them because they hate the Iranians and they're taking Israeli funding. Well, the Mujahideen-e-Khalq has a vested interest in the United States going to war in Iran because they want to lead Iran. And so, we got ourselves into this with bad intelligence and bad policy and no exit strategy. One final point. The president, it was my experience at the CIA that the people who most wanted to stay out of war were the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the Pentagon. Those people who have seen war are the least likely to want to go fight it again. And so what President Trump did over the last year was he fired all the generals on the Joint Chiefs of Staff and replaced them with his own hand-picked people who were perfectly happy to accept Israeli intelligence and go to war in Iran. I'm going to give you two answers. My own personal answer is, having watched President Trump all these years, I think that we're going to wake up one morning and we're going to see a posting on Truth Social in which he just announces that we won. The war's over. We won. I'm bringing the troops home. We're going to have a big military parade on Constitution Avenue. Congratulations to our victorious heroes in the military. Thank you for your attention to this matter, Donald J. Trump, President of the United States. I really believe that. He's just going to declare victory and come home. But I was at a dinner last week with several professors, full professors, who are also part-time advisors, paid advisors to the Pentagon leadership. And they are genuinely concerned that the Israelis are going to use a nuclear weapon. That the Iranians have proven to be far tougher than anybody expected. Anybody who's, blind, deaf, and dumb anyway. And they really believed that the Iranian government was a house of cards, where as soon as we fired the first rocket, the whole thing would collapse. These Democrats would rise up and everybody would live happily ever after. And that hasn't happened. And not only has that not happened, but the Iron Dome hasn't been so iron after all. Just this weekend, the Iranians were able to bomb Dimona, which is where the Israelis enrich their own uranium for their own nuclear weapons, which apparently we can neither confirm nor deny the existence of. Israelis are being killed. We have no idea how many, because it's now a crime punishable by up to 10 years in prison if you reveal any bomb damage assessment information, including the number of Israeli casualties. So how do we get out of this? If we decide just to come home, where does that leave the Israelis? It leaves the Israelis standing alone, and they can't abide that. And so these professors believe that there's this real danger of the Israelis finally using a nuclear weapon.
I was shocked when I heard it, to tell you the truth, because I respect these guys. I've known them for decades, and these are serious thinkers. But they were adamant that nuclear weapons are the final taboo, and that part of the Israeli calculation is, if they break that taboo, it'll free up other countries to use nuclear weapons, which might not be a bad thing. And I said, how is using a nuclear weapon not a bad thing? And the response was fascinating. One of them said to me, we're not talking about North Korea in this conversation. Do you know why? Because North Korea has a nuclear weapon. So nobody is going to mess with North Korea. The only reason that the United States and Israel attacked Iran is because they didn't yet have a nuclear weapon. If they had, there would have been no war, because that would have been the deterrent.
Absolutely not. Because at that point, they've won. That the United States already is the only country in the history of the planet to use a nuclear weapon, and we've done it twice. If we did it a third time, or allowed the Israelis to do it, I mean, that's going to be the end of the American empire. It really would be. We have a satirical paper here in the United States called The Onion, a very funny newspaper. And they had a headline last week, Chinese happy to sit back and watch U.S. destroy itself. And that's really, I think, what we're seeing right now. Almost none. Of course, Australia is a member of Five Eyes, like the United States is, along with Canada, the UK, and New Zealand. I never visited Australia while I was with the CIA. Never came a single time. I can count my meetings with Australian intelligence officials on these two fingers over the course of a 15-year career. But, it was always my understanding that the Australians were far more interested in China than they were in the area where I was, whether it was, European, it's quaint now, but European communist terrorism or the Middle East. I just never really encountered them.
Do you have any advice for Australians or we should be thinking about in terms of our government?
If I were in a position where my opinion actually had some heft behind it, I would say ignore this 5% in NATO besides the United States that spent 2% of GDP on defense. That was Greece because they're petrified of Turkey. Now we've got this 5% number floating around. Here in the United States, we have a $32 trillion, trillion with a T, $trillion national debt. The Chinese own a plurality of that debt. And so we just keep selling the Chinese more long-term government bonds. If they really wanted to just completely collapse the economy, they would just sell the bonds. and for all intents and purposes, the American economy would cease to exist. So over the long term, I just think that no country is able to keep this up. Australia should do what's right for Australia, regardless of American political pressure. And, Australia is also blessed, like the United States is, with oceans. And so we have oceans that help to protect us. Now, listen, I'm not a naif. I understand that China is a strategic threat, that North Korea might be a strategic threat, that Australia is going to have to work with Japan and South Korea and the Philippines and Thailand and others to make the South Pacific as safe as possible. But it's not the Chinese who have a history of hegemony in the region. They just don't. The Chinese, except for Tibet aside, and a handful of little border skirmishes with the Indians and the Vietnamese, the Chinese don't invade other countries. The United States invades other countries.
And what about Taiwan?
I think that the Chinese really believe that Taiwan will someday be reunited with the mainland, but I think the Chinese the Chinese have a very long view. It's a 5,000-year-old civilization. I think that they are willing to look at this like the Hong Kong model, rather than, the invasion and occupation model. It just doesn't make sense for them to do. I think we are. I struggle with the same things, Mark. People ask me all the time, where do you get your news? And the answer, and I hate to say it, but is I get it everywhere, because you can't trust just one or even two or even five outlets. You have to get it from everywhere and then immerse yourself in the information to the point where you can make an educated, analytic conclusion. So I start off with, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the LA Times, the Times of London, the Wall Street Journal, my hometown paper just for the sports. And then I go to Associated Press, CNN, MSNBC, Fox, then Al Jazeera. I do a couple of the smaller Middle Eastern outlets. But you're hours every day just immersing yourself in the news, hoping to get bits and pieces. I do the Jerusalem Post and Haaretz every morning. I have subscriptions to both. You can't trust any one outlet. You have to trust in yourself, and then trust in your ability to make that analysis make sense in your own position. It is a quandary. What I've done for a few years now is I've begun following people I respect on Twitter, X, and relying on them to give me the news that they think is important. So I'm getting the whole mainstream view from the mainstream outlets. But then I know, for example, that Alexander Mercouris at the Duran knows everything that's happening in Ukraine, for example, or that Max Blumenthal at the Gray Zone knows everything that's happening in Iran right now. I have some friends who cover Latin America, and I trust them. I know how honest they are and what great analysts they are. So maybe one of the things that you can do, or that anybody can do, is to identify people who really are seeking the truth without a political agenda and follow them.
So maybe you could just mention those names again. So we're talking about X. Give me someone who you would look at in relation to, say, Middle East.
Oh, Max Blumenthal or Aaron Mate, Mate. They're both terrific writers and analysts. Just excellent. Gideon Levy at Haaretz in Israel is one of the clearest thinkers on these issues that I've ever encountered, and is not afraid of his own government. He just wants the truth of a story. He's fantastic. I do follow Al Jazeera just because I know so many of them at Al Jazeera, and you can't rely on them for news about the Gulf because they're owned by the government of Qatar. But on the Arab-Israeli dispute, they're terrific. I've changed dramatically in the intervening years, not just because I'm so much older and more worldly, more mature, but my core beliefs about my own government have changed. I used to think that it was just so easy, so clear. There are good guys and bad guys, and we're the good guys. And that's just not, life is not that clear cut. It's not that simple. And I've also come around on the idea of foreign interventions. I made my bones at the CIA with the Iraqi invasion and occupation of Kuwait, and I went into Kuwait City with Marines on Liberation Day, February 17th, 1991. It was formative for me. But then, when we attacked Iraq in 2003, that's when I really began my transformation. That was a war of choice. We all knew that the Iraqi government had literally nothing to do with 9/11. Literally nothing. That was a lie that was being fed to the American people. We knew that the Iraqis had no weapons of mass destruction. I sat in on the meetings where the analysts were practically killing each other. The Department of Energy said, yes, there are weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons. And the CIA said, no, there are none. There were none. We knew there were none. And so I began to change my point of view in 2002. It really changed by 2003. And now I can't even think of a righteous war that's taking place anywhere in the world right now.